The public hearing for MFP will come to order, and let the record show Ms. Beebe, Ms. Bradford, Mr. Romer, Superintendent White, and the best staff members. We're pleased to offer this opportunity to the community to make comments, and I want to recognize Representative Stephen Artigo. Stephen in the audience, representing East Acadiana, and the floor is now open for any comments. And we do have, I believe, some speakers that want to. Okay. We do have some cards, and I'll go with these. Sean Fleming from Louisiana Departmental Disabilities Council. Let me remind you that we have a 3-minute rule. I'm not going to keep time on you, but please keep that in mind. I will, some people that would want to speak. I see one right over here, but if you would, please keep the 3-minute rule in mind.
Yes, sir, Mr. Lee. Thank you very much, Mr. Lee, Chairman, members of the committee. I'm with Sean.
I'm sorry. I also need you to identify yourself for the record.
Yes, sir. I'm Sean Fleming. I'm with the Louisiana Developmental Disabilities Council. I put a pose. You know, our council actually supports considerations into the MFP, but there are some specifics that have been put forth, and I've just had time to look at the documents with specifics. So I don't have specific. I do have some specific comments, but in general, the funding formula is based on, it says the least restrictive environment. There's a lot of confusion about whether that's inclusion or the setting. Least restrictive environment is a determination made after the student receives appropriate accommodations in an inclusive setting, and it actually, in the documents, it looks like it jumps even school settings are in category 1 and category 2 in terms of what's usually determined or defined as acuity level or severity of disability level. It's actually just using disability categories. As you all know, autism is a spectrum disorder. It's listed there as level 3. DHH just revised some of its criteria, recognizing that some students with autism are very low in terms of intensity, and some are very high, and that this formula does not take into that account at all. It's a much more significant step in terms of the evaluation of severity of a student. Regarding that, just in general, what I could see with the funding formula, it could actually penalize the school system that is serving a student who is particularly difficult to serve, who may be in their least restrictive environment, which may not be in the regular class. They may not be taking standardized tests, so they won't receive any credit, if you will, on any of those other levels, and yet that student is an extremely high cost, and I'm sure y'all are familiar with these students. So there doesn't seem to be any sort of condition or criteria for that, and that could be very detrimental to a school system trying to provide appropriate services in the least restrictive environment as defined by law, federal law. This formula should also not reinforce schools with extremely disproportionate representation of students with disabilities. I could see the case where a school could have a very high percentage of students with disabilities, be a fairly segregated school, have them included because they're in with the regular, classes, but the classes are not a proportionate representation of what's going on in society and be pulling down different amounts of money. I've not done the math on all that, but it seems like that there's room for either creating segregated schools or sending money to, I'll give the example of like magnet schools that serve extremely low percentages of students with disabilities. And so the difficulty with serving those students is less than a school with just a typical representation of the general population of students across disabilities. The other question is how this funding formula will be applied to the scholarship program, which if it comes back, and schools in that program are not required to provide any special education services at all. All these things will be, all these characteristics are basically defined by a local school system, and if that local school system starts off to be a scholarship program, it's unclear how those funding is going to go into a school that is not required to provide any services at all. That's a very deep concern of my council. I'm done. Thank you very much for hearing me, and I'll answer any questions. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, understand this is supposed to be a meeting to receive input, but I think Superintendent White might have a comment to make to address some of your concern.
First of all, I think they're all good points and much appreciated.
Yeah, right.
I think on the last point, the way that the scholarship law currently reads is that the school receives the tuition up to the average MFP for a child in that given parish, which takes into account the aggregate special education weighting. However, BESE...
No, sir. It actually, if I may clarify, I've done all the math on that, and the MFP is calculated and you add a student count. So there's about 630,000 students, I believe it is 680,000, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, actual students. And yet the MFP uses a 900,000 student count because it adds a lot of, because of the at-risk factors, and what the largest of those is students with disabilities. And even though we suspect, we in the disability community suspect that private schools are not accepting as many students with disabilities, the denominator of the MFP is going back to that 680,000 students, which basically takes the weight away that was applied to the students with disabilities. It peels it away.
Could I continue?
Yes, sir, I'm sorry.
Thank you. BESE is aware of the phenomenon that you're describing, which is why in February of last year, BESE put into its policy a statement that if a school's special education percentage, meaning a participating non-public school, is not exceeding a threshold established by BESE, BESE may reduce the per pupil amount so as to take into account the special education funds that they're actually not using, as you mentioned. So I was actually going to agree with your point and note that BESE has actually created a policy that's not, that you did not refer to in your statement, that speaks to that issue. So I agree with you. We're not disagreeing with you.
And I think there possibly, pardon me, will be some changes made in the formula to address some of this concern.
Do you see what I mean? In other words, essentially, what the system is the policy acknowledges is that when you factor in costs for students who might not have those dollars expended for them, then those dollars shouldn't be sent for those kids. So BESE has given itself the ability to make that adjustment in the MFP. To your overall points regarding the mechanics of how the funds are allocated, we agree with you that there is nuance required. And I think you're right, especially in disabilities like autism, where you have such a vast range of needs. Also, the need for defining least restrictive as opposed to inclusive, I think is very smart. We have just put out basically a statement that speaks to broad aspirations at this stage. The formula is not developed. It doesn't speak to specific policies. I think what the board would be helped by, if I could ask, is that I think what you see we're trying to do in raising special education as an issue is to serve many of the objectives that you and many of your comments at meetings have raised. And if you could help us by sharing what would be the specific ways that you would weight, maybe in an email or a public comment of some kind to the board that might be more detailed than can be given at the table, I think that'd be really helpful, because you're right, there are these distinctions within disabilities and in terms of the terminology that do need to be accounted for in the policy, and I would like to know how specifically you would do it. Does that, I don't need to do it here, but maybe on a follow-up letter or something of that type.
That would need to be a follow-up. But Mr. Fleming, you've used your time twice. But appreciate your input. Next we have Mr. Scott Richard.
Good morning. Scott Richard, representing the Louisiana School Boards Association. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comment on this most important matter. First and foremost, we must acknowledge that the state portion of the MFP has remained static for several years. The misnomer that the MFP has increased over time is just that for local school districts. The per pupil amount for students allocated to the MFP from the state has not increased. Student enrollment has increased, which has caused the MFP to increase across the state, but not for respective districts and per pupil funding. Secondly, there have been several costs that have one way or another been passed on to local school districts. Mandates with no money attached to it, or at one time had funding attached to it, that local districts and local school boards have had to absorb. And it's important to note, for the sake of discussion, that there is a law based from Act 749 passed in 2010 that prohibits unfunded mandates. However, those things continue to be passed on to local school districts. School boards cannot continue to take on more financial burdens and initiatives and maintain the same level of services to students. We all know that we have foreseeable increased costs as it relates to major initiatives in regards to Common Core state standards and park assessments. The State Department, Superintendent White, BESE, has acknowledged that many districts are not at a level of functioning capacity to implement park assessments. Please be mindful that struggles in districts occur on a regular basis in regards to facilities and infrastructure. Louisiana is one of 7 states that has no funding for facilities in its state funding formula. Please be mindful of the struggle of districts as it relates to hidden costs that sometimes BESE is not aware of. Bonded indebtedness and bond ratings for school districts will be compromised if the MFP is reduced, the state portion of the MFP is reduced. Many districts have desegregation litigation costs that they must incur. Many districts are refocusing their efforts on school safety issues that will cause incurred expenses. Many districts are one natural disaster, one flood, one rain event, one hurricane, one tornado from the brink of financial crisis. Please be mindful of all of these issues as you formulate the new formula for the 13-14 school year. And one last comment, we'd ask that on behalf of the school boards that the BESE take into consideration equity and adequacy that is part of the formula. We all know that there are approximately 10 states that have active litigation that are currently addressing the lack of equity and the lack of adequacy in a state funding formula. We don't want to get in a posture where we return to active litigation that has been conducted in the past in regards to ensuring that our state funding formula for public education is focused on equity and adequacy. Many of you on the board may not be aware of those past litigation issues, but I know, Mr. Lee, that you are very much aware of those issues from the past. And finally, please be mindful as you formulate the new formula for 13-14 that we are in a state where there is a serious lack of basic infrastructure in many communities, a state where several live in poverty, a state that has lost a congressional seat due to a loss of population. Please Please make the K-12 MFP state funding formula a priority in our state, and make sure that it is not a minimum formula and that it focuses on equity and adequacy for all school districts. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Richard.
Could I just say something briefly, Mr.
Okay.
Ray? Thank you. I want to, first of all, just extend gratitude to Mr. Richard. You have chosen to, while we have not agreed on every issue, the School Board Association is making an extremely valuable contribution to a recent effort that we've launched, our burden reduction task force. I think one thing you said I agree with strongly, which is that on the policy-making side, if regulators don't pay attention to every little hidden cost and every little rule they make, the aggregate becomes an untenable, not just financial situation, but student achievement situation. And clearly, the School Board Association is going to make very valuable contributions to trying to limit the amount of reporting and compliance work that goes on and takes up valuable time away from students. I thank you for that. I hope that many who represent education districts, unions, and others here today will recognize that many of our efforts that are coming up in front of the board today are made in an attempt not so much to for financial purposes, but so that school districts and schools can actually focus on kids rather than focusing on government rules. And I thank you all for being a part of that specific work.
I think you've made your points very well, Mr. Richard. Would like to remind the board members that we have written letter comments, concerns expressed by Mr. Don Goday, who is the business manager in Lafourche Parish. He could not be here this morning, but he wanted his comments on record. Next, we have Mr. Jack Loop.
Mr. Loop, if you could just hit the button there on the... Thank
Stars. Jack Loop for the Coalition for Louisiana Public Education. Obviously, my colleagues are going to mention many of the things there that we feel important to us, and as a school board member from St. Tammany, I just thought I would mention just a couple points specific to our parish that we have discussed. Had parent forums on to let them know what we feel was money situations there that could very possibly be brought up before them before our next school year, and we're very concerned about it. For example, in the last 3 years, St. Tammany Parish, we've had an increase of 1,056 students, but yet at the same time, the MFP funding has decreased by $290 per student. As well as the transfer students in St. Tammany, we have a wealth of those, nearly 200, and at one time, their tuition was being taken out of one pot of money, but is now going to be taken from some of ours, it appears, if it's not ruled unconstitutional, and this certainly would bring an A school district that we are now, because of the systems and the programs that we have put in place. We are now seeing that those could certainly pull back some of our programs. The health, retirement, and transportation costs have just skyrocketed, and we believe there that this MFP is so important coming up for this year there that it's critical there that you all keep those things in mind, certainly what Mr. Richard has brought up. Thank you very much for your time.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Luke. Our next speaker is Mr. Steve Monahan.
Thank you, Chairman Lee and Superintendent White, members of committee. I also appreciate the opportunity to speak to the issue, and I always appreciate the opportunity to speak to any issue as a citizen of the state and as an advocate for teachers. 3 minutes and I'll be done, probably sooner than that. There are people on this committee and on this BESE board that have a great deal more history than I do with the MFP, but I do have some, and I want to make some very, very specific recommendations within the context of how I see reality and how many teachers see reality. I think the point's been well made that for 4 years the MFP has been frozen. And within that context of a frozen MFP, there are those that could argue, would argue perhaps that the MFP is already adequately funded and there are billions of dollars within that MFP. I think where reasonable people could agree, though, is that no one really knows the answer to that question other than a subjective opinion on regard to what we think the cost of education is. Since we have to go back to 2005, 2006, when the state of Louisiana entertained and sanctioned what was called the MFP task force. And there were actually serious discussions regarding discovering what would constitute adequacy in regard to education. What are the components of adequacy? What does it require to provide every child with an equal educational opportunity? I think it's important from the perspective of Louisiana Federation of Teachers and its membership that those conversations be resurrected. Otherwise, I think we're going to lose sight of where we want to go. I think if one of the simple metaphors that we used back during those discussions was one that relates to engineering. If you are going to build a bridge or you're going to build a house, you know what kind of bridge you want, you know how much you have to spend on it, and you don't try to build that which you can't pay for. One of the noble exercises that the state's been involved in is to try to provide every child with a world-class education without becoming definitional about it. So that would be a specific recommendation that the MFP task force actually get back together in discussions and research be done in regard to costing out education. The second piece I'd like to, and I do understand the rest of the meeting is going. Today's meetings will be a lot of it will have to do with policy changes in regard to the service of students, but under the guise of flexibility. I think flexibility is becoming the new watchword in education, and flexibility from this person's perspective is often defined on what we can afford. If we can't afford to provide services that perhaps we'd like to provide to students, and we're not going to generate the revenues necessary to do it, then it's only common sense to provide the flexibility to eliminate those services. While that may not be the best educational course that we'd like to take. And I would close on that issue by simply saying this. There were those who will argue that it is indeed in the best interest to give flexibility in these matters of librarians and counselors and seat time and the rest. I think all of those things should be a discussion that's weighed within the context of research, and that there is actually evidence that that actually is happening. Close, and this is it, I promise you, Mr. Lee.
Good.
There are rumors out there and rumors of rumors and rumors of rumors of rumors. One rumor that's been circulating around our world is that there is going to be a push to reduce the MFP this year, not just freeze it at 2.5, but to actually reduce it to cover costs that were included in the MFP last year that are subject to litigation now. I said rumors of rumors of rumors. So I would urge that those rumors remain rumors, and that when we get down to crunch time, that there is no truth to the rumors that there may be a push to reduce the MFP further. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Monahan. I want to take just a minute to recognize one of our fellow board members. Ms. Lottie Beebe is the newest school superintendent in the state. That's today. Now tomorrow there might be another one, but as I appreciate it, she's just been named superintendent in St. Martin Parish, and want to offer congratulations. You can look at the two of us and see she's just starting as a superintendent, and I just completed 33 years, so she's got a little ways to go. But it's my understanding that she has been successful in convincing that board that St. Martin is going to make advancements they've never seen before. There are not going to be any problems. They're going to be a model for the entire state. So we're glad to see we have a problem solver. Congratulations, Ms. Beebe. And our next speaker is the president of the Superintendents Association, Mr. Mike Falk. Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Lee, and I have been asked by the Superintendents Association to share some thoughts, recommendations on the MFP, and as was alluded to earlier, the per pupil amount has been frozen for 4 years. Growth has not been placed in the formula. This past year we had programs that were generally funded outside of the MFP that were rolled in to the MFP And as the Constitution states, MFP funding should be directed to funding public education K through 12. The following areas we believe should be addressed in the current MFP. Number one, money is dedicated for various programs: Virtual Charter Academy, charter schools, Louisiana Connections, Office of Juvenile Justice, State Special School District, Louisiana School for the Deaf and Visually Impaired. Needs to be more accountability of that money. Information needs to be provided to school districts regarding the names of students from each district for whom funding is being deducted. The excuse of FERPA is a lame, weak excuse. We know, understand, and comply with FERPA guidelines. So should the Department of Education. It would probably be far-fetched to seek restoration of the 2.75% growth factor. However, many districts are in dire need of that factor being reinstituted. Some of the financial issues that districts face across this state. Number one, decline in enrollments. There are some districts who do have increased enrollment, but the majority see decline in enrollments. There are reduced local revenues due to the economy. The increased retirement costs have gone from 15.5% employer contribution in 2008 to where next year is projected to be about 27.5%. That's the employer share. Increased health, employer. Increased health costs on the average are expected to increase 6 to 8%. One district last year had a 30% increase in their premiums. Increased costs for mandated training with the bullying, with the suicide prevention, with sexual harassment, and all the required trainings that we have to provide for our teachers. The increased cost of professional development due to the implementation of Common Core state standards and the new assessments. Normal inflationary increases across the board of 3 to 5%. The future increases in cost to technology capability to be able to institute the new assessment programs. The future increases in cost to provide reasonable safety measures in schools for safety and security. Implementation of new salary schedules. The districts are still trying to determine the projected long-term cost of new salary schedules. And finally, I believe that the 2011-2012 formula should be proposed for the 2013-14 school year, and that a comprehensive evaluation be conducted with the involvement of business managers and superintendents to ensure that the equity issue is properly addressed and provided for per the requirements of the state constitution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Faulkner. Our next speaker, I think we'll limit to 2 minutes because he's a man of few words, Mr. Lee Myers.
Good morning. My name is Lee Meyer. Am I on?
You're on.
And I'm representing the Assumption Parish School Board, and thank you for that introduction, Mr. Lee. And I want to wish everybody on the board a Happy New Year, and I want to let you all know that my New Year's resolution was to make sure that I took my meds before I came, and I will be very, very calm when I speak to you as a board. And again, let me just reiterate things I've said in the past. I do appreciate what you do. You have a, I don't want to call it a job because it's not a job. It's a responsibility that you have to the school boards, the students, the teachers, the parents, the public, for what goes on up here. So, again, I'm going to be very, very calm, and I got what? I'll go with 2. First, all I want to do is, like a student in the classroom will say, they took all my answers. Well, they took everything I wanted to say. But we do, and we would appreciate reinstating either a portion of or the 2.75 that was originally in the budgets. Mr. Falk and Mr. Richard told you all of the other reasons why we need them. Mr. Richard says we are one catastrophe away from losing money. Well, we have that sinkhole that's already costing us money in Assumption Parish. We may have to reroute students, we may have to build new roads, that's police jury business, but we may have to do those. So what I'm asking is what I asked Mr. Walter Lee many times in this hall here. Just send it to the legislature. If they don't like it, let them send it back. But at least give yourselves and us the opportunity to ask for it. You know what they're going to tell you, but at least let them have that opportunity to say no. And then put it on their backs, because you know we need it. Secondly, the last thing I want to say is I want to thank the superintendent for his kind words to Mr. Richard before he left. I originally wanted to say LSBA, I am the vice president of LSBA right now, and what I'd like to say about Mr. Richard is he has done a wonderful job in building a strong relationship with the BESE, the legislature, and we intend to keep that relationship going strong. Again, I appreciate what you do, and thank you for allowing me to get up here today.
Good. Thank you.
You missed what I said, Kenny.
I'll come sit with you.
Okay, and I can tell you again what I said.
It's a deal.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Our last speaker is Ms. Susan Vaughn.
Thank you. Susan Vaughn, I'm Director of Special Education in Ascension Parish, and I'm here today representing the Louisiana Association of Special Education Administrators. A couple of things about the MFP, because I know the special ed weights are being considered. A couple of points I would like to, and I just very briefly read it real fast, but there's a couple of points that I think need consideration. There was a category for disability and severity, and mild, moderate were lumped together in that. There are very extreme differences between a mild child and a moderate child and the types of services that they require. The same with autistic children. They were in category 3 as the most severe, but we have some autistic children who are in inclusion regular ed classes for most of the day. So putting weights on MFP according to an exceptionality will not necessarily provide the funding for the services that different children need. As the federal government has said, every child is an individual, and just because they're labeled a certain exceptionality does not classify the types of services and resources that they may require. Another thing that I'm concerned about is
I don't mean to interrupt your time, but would you mind, Mr. Chairman, if I could could you add just a point of clarity? How would you then, because I think we would probably, everyone in the room would agree some kids cost more to educate than others. How would you draw the distinction?
That's a very good question. I know y'all's job is very difficult trying to figure this out, and your comment to Mr. Fleming, I talked to a couple of the other directors, so we need to go back and see what would be a good way.
Maybe we can dialogue.
Right, and come back with that.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
The other thing is there's a thing about environment, that to encourage placement in the most optimal settings. I guess I take as a director of special ed, and I've been in special ed for 30 years, I find it my responsibility as an advocate for our special students that it's our responsibility in the district to provide the most optimal settings, and with the parents make those decisions. I hope we're not making those decisions just because of cost of services. So I'm not sure how equity can come into that piece of it. And then the last piece is going to be considered is performance, and I have concerns with that because, again, an exceptionality doesn't mean how the student functions necessarily or the resources or services that they need. There's such a huge spectrum, and that's why it's an individual education plan. It's hard to allot a specific dollar for a child and slice and dice up services based on money and where that child should be. So I just would challenge everybody to try to come up with an equitable formula. I know it's very difficult because every child is an individual and every district in this state is different. Our population continues to grow in Ascension Parish, and we're doing the best we can to serve everyone. But we have a pot of money, so if this child needs more, they get more. And if this one was funded with, and it's not a static population, you know, sometimes it's very transient and it comes and goes, and MFP is usually decided once or twice a year, and that's it. So I'm not sure if tying it to a specific child will help, but thank you for listening and considering my points.
Good. Thank you for your input. I don't have any more cards. Do I assume that that takes care of the ones that have expressed interest in speaking? Any board members have any comments before we adjourn? Okay, this concludes the comment time that's been provided for the MFP, and our next